I've lived my entire life in a very rural area in Tennessee, and this happened either the summer of 1992 or 1993. At the time, I was a preteen. I can still see this in my mind, almost as if it happened yesterday. Like I said before, a rural area in Tennessee where we used to have some serious issues with people dumping unwanted, worn-out items and garbage down our beautiful hillsides and ravines. At that time, it was common to find illegal dumping sites everywhere because there was no bulk pickup offered by our one waste disposal monopoly in this part of the state. The economic disparity is obvious. You have some of the poorest people imaginable, coupled with some folks that own multiple mansions and vacation homes. My family fell somewhere in the upper middle class. To relate it to the movie Titanic, which was one of my favorite films of all time, we would be either the lowest rung of first class or the very top of second class. Unfortunately, the majority of our neighbors and community would be in steerage or the coal bunker. Well, it was August here in Tennessee, aka sun's scorching heat, and enough humidity to make it slightly uncomfortable to even breathe. Many describe it as the swamp capital of the state. Anyway, we had just had an extraordinarily rare murder in our county. It was all that anyone was talking about. All you could hear in our churches, grocery stores, and beauty salons. The victim was largely unknown, a woman in her early 30s and nowhere near wealthy. I didn't know her, nor did it seem like anyone else in my neighborhood did. She had moved here less than a year before and kept to herself, so she hadn't even been reported missing. Then, just before our summer break came to an end, this lady was found at the base of a steep incline, deep in one of our densely wooded areas, by some folks who were out for a nature hike. There she was found, at the base of a large illegal dump, on a winding dirt road that was barely wide enough for a single vehicle. If you met another car, one of you would have to pull over so far, you'd be almost entirely off the road. What adds a layer of creepiness to this? The road's name was Bone Road. When she was found, this poor woman had been decapitated. Although both her upper and lower body were recovered, her killer hadn't been caught. So, my mom was born and raised here, and was strong, yet of goofy stock. She's always been my best buddy, even when dropping the hammer on my brother and myself. She was loved by every student that she ever taught in her capacity as a teacher. Our friends adored my goofy mama, often telling me just how lucky I was to have her. My dad was a pharmacist in our area, smarter than most, and happy to go fill a lost or forgotten prescription, even late into the night. My dad isn't originally from here, but is very well known because of his job. Everyone knows my mom, because she and most of our huge family have been here since our ancestors settled here in the late 1800s. The rest of her family lived in Middle Tennessee. On that particular day in August, we had been in a family reunion picnic at the beautiful, naturally made lake that we live near, when suddenly, as it's known to do in the summer here, a scattered thunderstorm popped up and brought our get-together to an abrupt end. It was just me and my mom on the ride home, where she got the wild idea to have us go play Sherlock Holmes and Watson. She wanted to go see the crime scene. I know, brilliant idea, Mom. My dad was at work and my brother was with a friend. Like I said, this was 92 or 93, so no GPS, Alexa, Siri, Google Earth, not even MapQuest. My dad was on our school board and had been given a highly detailed map of our entire county. Since neither of us knew how to reach Bone Road, it was agreed that the map would be our guide. We went home, swooped up the map, and set out like we were Magellan. We eventually found the place and headed to the spot, and being the ignorant rubberneckers we were, we had just planned to drive past this stupid dump site. I can't begin to explain just how creepy this place was. A murder dump in the middle of nowhere, on a road that started with blacktop, transitioned to gravel, and then good old country dirt. It was mid-afternoon, but the sudden rain on the August ground made the area steamy. Listeners who are from the South might know what I mean. Literal steam was emanating from the road, the fields, the woods, everywhere, and this just added to the thrill of our folly. As we approached the location, there was a blind curve, making it impossible to see the place until you were right up on it. Once we rounded that corner, we saw that we weren't alone. There was a very dirty man who had his very dirty truck pulled over at the dump site, just far enough to allow us to pass. Now, sure, Joe Dirt could have just been another looky-loo like us, but he gave off a creepy as fuck vibe, just standing by his truck, looking downward into the dump. It wasn't a sheriff's officer after all. We knew all our local authorities, and they had cleared the location a day or so before. Now anyone could access the area. I look out the window as we pass him, and we're so close that I can see his 2 teeth, clear as day. Literally, a 2-tooth smile in this uber creep-tastic, almost leering sort of way. Not nice, far from friendly. We got past and thanked the Lord that Mr. Two-Tooth hadn't followed us. We agreed we would reach the end of Bone Road and get the hell out of there. Oh, you know there's a but. We reached the end of Bone Road, ending at a field. Bone Road was a dead end, no pun intended. My mom said the words that I had been screaming in my head since we passed that man. Oh, we had no choice. We had to do a 5-point turn and go back the direction that we came from. Oh, I bet he's gone now. That was my mom's feeble attempt to soothe us both. But guess what? He was still there. He was still smiling his huge, sporadically tooth-populated smile. Now, as an adult, I reflected on this. That man could have come after us, knowing that we would have been cornered. And to this day, I'm wondering why he never did. We made it out unscathed, of course, and my father hit the roof when he heard the tapestry of idiocy our afternoon adventure was. It's at this point that we hit our second iteration of but, because you always know there's a but coming. Days later, our newspaper heralded the good news. The murderer had been caught. This woman had been killed by a boyfriend turned stalker. She had moved here from a town about 45 minutes away, just to get away from him, but wouldn't you know it, he found her. He drove around with her body in his truck before happening upon the dump. Murder solved. Case closed. Happily ever after? Not exactly. As we stared down at this guy's mugshot, it was real. Mr. Two-Tooth was our killer. We never told my dad that part. Eventually, the killer was convicted of first-degree murder and abuse of a corpse. He will die in the state prison system, serving life without the possibility of parole. Still, Mom and I promised we would never be so dumb again. We still have weird adventures, but none to freaky, remote murder dump sites on unknown terrain, and with no one knowing where we are. We really could have met our end on that dead-end road. It's an odd thing, knowing that you've been face-to-face with a brutal murderer, not once, but twice. I've always heard in TV and from Hollywood that the murderer will occasionally revisit the scene of the crime. I had no idea that was actually a thing, though, not just dramatized for my entertainment on Law & Order or some other big-budget movie that I'm watching. When I think about driving down that desolate road that day and coming across a man who had just extinguished the life of someone that he cared about, I'm left wondering, what are the odds? Back in the early 90s, what I would call my formative years, I was living in Colorado with my family. I was 15 years old at the time, a sophomore in high school, was supremely active in many social circles, and even had a fun relationship with my first boyfriend. And like you do at that age, when in a relationship, you want to spend as much of your time as possible with the person that is new, exciting, and is just as pumped to see you as you are them. So, this led me to spending a lot of time at my boyfriend's house, hanging out with him, his dog, and his family. For this story, let's call my boyfriend Drew. His mom was Deb, and Deb's boyfriend is Tom. Because of the amount of time I spent in that household, I got to know Deb and Tom fairly well. Deb was friendly, but it also seemed that by this point of parenthood, like she might be more interested in her own life than in parenting Drew. It seemed odd, the kind of distant relationship they had. One where Drew knew his mom would always be home, but not necessarily willing to talk, listen, or help solve anything that he was going through. Deb much preferred spending time with Tom. They'd go out to the local bars, events around town, even weekends away, usually just resulting in her getting trashed before coming home and passing out, or being of no use to anyone else. Tom himself seemed like a pretty interesting guy. He seemed like the responsible one, the adult in the room, even on multiple occasions taking it upon himself to drive me home in the event that I stayed at Drew's house too late into the evening and missed the last bus. I think he was in his 30s, or maybe early 40s at that time. He didn't have kids of his own, and while I always remember him having money for trips or casino stops, I can't really recall what his job was, or if he even had one. Tom was always kind to me. So one night when he offered to take me home so I wouldn't have to be cold in the chilly Colorado evening, I had zero hesitation hopping into his truck. However, after that night, I never looked at Tom quite the same again. I remember being on Highway 9. I remember the car's heater being on. Hell, I even remember this song on the radio, Losing My Religion by R.E.M., when Tom sort of just blurts out, "It would be a shame to get lost out there," as he nods out into the dark wilderness alongside the highway. It's like, the woods are beautiful and all, but in the wrong situation, plenty can go wrong. At first, I simply thought it was a weird direction for conversation. He's not wrong either. As someone that grew up camping and fishing with my own family, those words do ring true. A lot of things can happen when removed from civilization. But it was the next thing that he said that absolutely ate away at me from the inside. He said, "If anyone ever tries to take you into the woods, their intentions aren't anything good." Tom wasn't my dad. I actually barely knew him in the scheme of things. So to hear this type of life lesson, unprovoked, gave me chills all over. I think the ride was pretty much silent from that point on, even bordering on tense. Before he pulled into my parents' driveway and I got out, I remember being polite and saying, "Goodbye, thanks for the ride," while also silently pledging to myself that that was the last ride I'd be accepting from him. From that point on, Drew and I spent much more time at my house. Every time he would leave, I'd see him to the door, and more often than not, it was Tom coming to get him from the driver's seat of his Ford. He'd wave, and I'd wave back. But each time I did so, it left me with that same uneasy feeling from that night, and I could never quite explain why. Well, fast forward a little bit. My relationship with Drew ended, as many first loves do. Although not together, we were still friends. When I began my senior year in 1995, I spent much of that year trying to figure out plans for prom, upcoming college choices, and the like. But towards the end of the year, I noticed a bit of change in Drew. He was quieter, withdrawn, and almost more standoffish than I had ever seen him before. I eventually asked what was wrong one day, and that's when he spilled the entire situation. His mother, Deb, had been down in the dumps for a while after she and Tom had broken up. Tom had moved far away, and Deb took a lot of the frustrations of that ended relationship out on Drew. I did my best to sympathize with him, thinking that that was the brunt of what he was going through, but that wasn't it. He said that Tom was now back in the picture. My naive self thought, well, that'll be nice. He'll be there to take some of your mom's negative attention away from you. But Tom wasn't back because he wanted to be. He was back because Colorado authorities were extraditing him from his new home, the West Virginia Department of Corrections, back to Colorado to face charges for first-degree murder for a young woman that went missing in 1993, one whose body had just been found up Highway 40 near Empire. Turns out, his mom's boyfriend had a penchant for committing crimes against women, going back a decade, if not longer. All of these following things I learned during the 1996 trial of Thomas Edward Luther. He had been convicted of picking up a hitchhiker in 1982, beating her with a hammer before sexually assaulting her. He had stabbed another woman who had placed an ad to sell a car in 1993. After moving to West Virginia in 1994, he yet again picked up another hitchhiker before raping and beating her. This was the crime that he had just been sentenced guilty for, before being brought back to Colorado, where he was now being tried for the murder of 20-year-old Sher Elder. Apparently, Tom and Sher had been hanging out with a group of friends the night that she went missing. Security cameras caught sight of the two of them leaving a casino together, making Tom the last one to see her alive. When she was found buried under a pile of rocks in a remote area, authorities determined that she had been shot 2 times in the back of her head from close range. She would have died immediately. Luther was eventually found guilty and sentenced to life in prison. The only thing that kept him from the death penalty was a single juror that did not believe that his attack on Sher was premeditated. So, instead of a guilty verdict on first-degree murder, they got him on second-degree murder instead. He will reside within a Colorado state penitentiary until his heart no longer beats. I'm in my 40s now. Far removed from that teenager that sat in a passenger seat across from Thomas Edward Luther. A passenger seat that had been occupied by many other young women, many of whom faced the monster within him, some of whom didn't survive that encounter. It's not lost on me just how lucky I was to be dropped off alive and safe each of those nights back in the 90s. Because I know that wasn't the case for several other people. Part of me still wonders about what he said to me that night. Was he contemplating taking me into the woods? Did he say those things aloud so that subconsciously or otherwise I'd know just how lucky I was to be going home? How things could have played out so much differently for me had he not stayed on the highway and taken me into the woods, knowing full and well that his intentions were anything but good? If you're anything like me and into true crime shows or channels, you may have heard this story before, or at least the main details. I've seen it covered in several myself. Here's a little background. This event happened nearly 15 years ago. I had just turned 18 and moved to Orange County, California. I moved into an apartment complex near the community college that I was attending, so a bunch of younger people around my age lived there. I didn't know a single person in California, so I would take any opportunity to socialize and meet new people. A big gathering place at the complex was the main pool, where people would drink and relax in the sun. Over the first few months, I would meet a bunch of people while hanging out there. I never got super close to any of them, but I would see these same people several days a week. We would often go back to each other's apartments after the pool to drink or smoke some more. It was a really mellow and fun environment. 3 people I would see all the time were Sarah, Mike, and John. One day, after hanging out at the pool, Sarah, my girlfriend, and I went back to my apartment. The 3 of us smoked, and Sarah went back home. Just a typical, regular day. The next day, we all found ourselves at the pool once more. Although there were a few of the usual people missing, but still a solid 10 people gathering, so we didn't really notice. We go home later that night, and my girlfriend gets a call from one of our friends. My girlfriend playfully answers her phone, and the expression on her face begins to change. She's just listening, and her eyes get super wide. She blurts out, "What? Are you serious?" before closing her clamshell phone to hang up. I'm super confused, so I ask her, What happened?" She says, "Dude, the police just found Sarah dead in Mike's apartment, and Mike is nowhere to be found." This was absolutely insane. I asked her if the friend said anything else, but she told me it was really hard to understand. We eventually went to bed that night and met up with our usual crowd at the pool the next day, which included John and his fiancée. We're all talking about how unbelievable this was. Sarah was the epitome of sweet, and Mike was easily one of the kindest people that I'd ever met. He was one of the first people that I met when I moved, and he gave my underaged ass some beer and told me some awesome stories of his life. These were both good people, and it didn't make any sense. We all kind of started speculating and just did our best to make sense of it. Nobody could get a hold of Mike. We also started to worry if he's safe. Somebody suggested that Mike probably killed Sarah, then panicked and took off. That was a hard pill to swallow for most of us, but it was the only thing that made any bit of sense. John shook his head and said, "Man, just awful." We all dispersed and went our separate ways. It would be the last time that I would see most of these people. Fast forward a month or two. I was hanging out in my apartment one evening when my girlfriend calls me frantically. The first thing out of her mouth is a plea to come to her friend's apartment. The last thing she said was, "You're not going to believe this. It's the most fucked up thing I've ever heard." Needless to say, I rushed over to the apartment where my girlfriend was. She was with 2 of our mutual friends from the pool. One of them was crying hysterically, while the other sat with him. My girlfriend motioned for me to go outside, and the other friend stayed back to keep consoling the other one. Once we were out of earshot, She told me exactly why her friend was crying so intensely. Her friend had just gotten back from being with the police. He was asked to identify pieces of a dismembered body that were found in the sewer. He was crying because he positively identified the body parts as Mike's. How exactly did the police know they were there? They knew because John had told them. Turns out John was, and still is, a broke piece of shit. This bastard was engaged and didn't have enough money for his wedding. Being an organized and well-put-together person, Mike had a bunch of money saved up. John found out about it and decided to kill Mike and take his money. John was an acting student and asked Mike to help him move some heavy things in the theater. When Mike's back was turned, John shot him. He then took Mike to another location, where he dismembered his body and dumped the remains into the sewer. John took Mike's keys and phone and then went back to Mike's apartment. From there, he texted Sarah on Mike's phone, asking her to come over because he wanted to talk. Being the sweet and caring person she was, Sarah went over to Mike's apartment without even questioning the situation. When she got there, John snuck up behind her and shot her as well. He left the apartment and framed Mike for Sarah's murder. John was caught because of how big of an idiot he was. He paid some kid to withdraw money from Mike's ATM account. Cops found the kid, and the kid dimed out John. They quickly tracked John down at his own bachelor party. He was taken in for questioning, where he would later admit that he murdered both Sarah and Mike. Eventually, John was tried, found guilty, and sentenced to death. At the sentencing, Mike's dad spoke to John across the courtroom and said, "My only regret is that the state of California doesn't allow me to kill you myself." Turns out, John's fiancée tried to help him hide evidence, and she was sentenced to time as well. All in all, pretty dark story. Aside from the violence, what messes me up is that this guy had literally just murdered two of our friends, and he was back at the pool, commiserating with us, like genuinely acting upset, sad, and confused. He's a horrible human, and I hope he suffers for the rest of his life, however long that may be. My deepest and continued condolences go out to the family and friends of the two innocent people that lost their lives far too soon. I just wanted to add a personal note here. This is a validated account of an actual double murder that occurred. While most of the details depicted are accurate in nature, LP originally changed the names of those involved. But for those of you that wish to learn more about the horrific events shared here, this is the case of Daniel Wozniak, who in the summer of 2010 took the lives of his friends Sam Hare and his girlfriend Julie Kabushi. Wozniak was sentenced in September of 2016 and currently sits on California's death row.